Hey guys, this week we read chapters 12 and 13 from our text. Chapter 12 is coercion and the conscience. So in this chapter, it states that we don't feel conscience. It is referred to our tendency to do basically the right thing from the wrong where punishment is involved. And it talks about how the root of conscience of where it came from, which is it came from coercive control. Because we want to avoid punishment, we are coerced to do the right thing. And so we attribute to conscience the acts of avoidance. And so during, I guess, our adolescent years when we're a baby to a child, this is the time where our conscience is shaped because there is complete supervision where, our parents and teachers and everyone around us are watching over us, and so the development of conscience is pretty critical during this time for early training and education. So, for example, when you're a baby, like say you're a toddler, learn to crawl, or a baby learn how to crawl. Um, in the book, it says that, talks about how a child would continuously try touching the vase, but you don't want to, the mom doesn't want you touching the vase in case it breaks, and it's safety hazard and such. The mom will repeatedly say no. The baby will continue to try to touch it. The mom would continue to say no. The baby would try to touch it again. This time, mom would probably try to block it and such. And so it'll keep going until eventually the temptation stops. So, so from as a child, they learn bad. And as they get older, they learn illegal or immoral. And so we learn that these types of words, these single words or sentences, they can represent many different situations, and that our actions can lead to punishment, as quoted in the text. It's easy to know right from wrong, Joey. Wrong is when everybody yells. And so this is kind of important to learn during the speech and language development. And so also during this time, a child or children are looked after or watched over strictly, as they're being called out on any sides of disobedience, disorderliness, or any sorts of bad behavior deemed by our society. Um, and so we punish any kind of conduct that fails to meet our standards, and people avoid getting in. So we learn what would get us in trouble, and so we learn to avoid getting in trouble, or people avoid getting in trouble because it would bring conflict to the community at large, and bringing trouble would make you kind of like the outlaw, and you would be considered as untrustworthy. And so society, it depends on an individual's conscience for survival. So for this chapter, I would like you to tell me about a time where you didn't think you had a clear conscience on a situation, or you can also talk about if when you witness someone not have a clear conscience. Chapter 13, Between a Rock and a Hard Place. So reading that title and at the end of reading the chapter, you kind of see what the title means. So basically, we don't really realize that coercion is always happening around us. Either we're on the receiving end of the stick or we are wielding the stick, as the text says. And so punishment, escape, and avoidance, they rarely occur separately from one another. So if we intended to only punish, we also generate escape and avoidance behaviors. So if we sense that we are getting in trouble, there's a chance that we're running away from it. And people react to coercion in different ways. And the text says if someone was threatened with losing a job, one might work harder and one might quit. And the person who quits, they probably, had other options of finding a job. However, some of the contingencies that happen around us, we don't really have control over. It's pretty much unavoidable, so we don't have many adaptive choices to deal with it. And so we aren't able to turn it off or prevent it or prevent, this shock from happening. So the text asks is, what happens when such intense shocks threaten, um, and we are unable to make them go away when we have no place to hide or to run for safety? And so it goes on and talks about how we have been conditioned to suppress. So using or talking about the lab rat example, um, in the experiment, a tone was delivered to the rat and it had no effect on the rat until there was a shock delivered at the end of the tone, in which then the tone has become a signal for an unavoidable shock. And so the subject, or the rat, was observed to stop his activity and go into behavioral depression. So outside of the lab rat experiment, this is what anxiety looks like. And when something bad is going to happen and we can't prevent it, we pretty much stop productive behavior. We, um, okay, sorry. And we apply coercion with the intention of teaching people how to keep themselves from being punished. And so since we don't always set up contingencies effectively, sometimes the shocks we want people to avoid become unavoidable. And so that is saying that um, how sometimes coercion, since it can't be escaped or prevented, it kind of brings us into a hopeless state. So for example, an example they use is the police officer. So you see a police officer in uniform, you get pulled over, and you're pretty much scared, right? And if you're scared, you're reacting in a way that you might show signs of guilt, and so the police officer is going to respond to your signs of guilt. Or another example they use of coercion is organ donating. You Nowadays it's kind of like you're kind of stuck between, like I said, like the text says, between a rock and a hard place. So in this situation, um, you have a family member who is in dire need of an organ placement, or they could die, and you're capable of donating that organ. However, you're also putting yourself at risk of anything that can happen during a transplant. And so you're left with the option of whether to put yourself at risk or to save a loved one's life. And that's a pretty difficult choice where you're pretty much just faced with this unavoidable shock, but you're not in a place with many choices. And but however, condition suppression on occasion can turn out to be useful. And we were built as species to have a surrender mechanism that converts behavior suppression into successful avoidance. So sometimes avoiding certain behaviors might work out for you in the end, I guess. Um, so the question that the text asks is, will a subject become more anxious when exposed more often to warning signals and shocks? So basically it says, from the lab rat example, it concluded that the more frequent signals and shocks were delivered, there was less anxiety emitted. But the less frequent signals and shocks were delivered, there was more anxiety. And this was shown because to keep from losing more, we adapt to frequent warning signals by continuing to work productively instead of, giving in into our anxiety. So that is the end of chapter 13. And so for my question, I guess I would like to know about a time when you felt anxious about a situation that felt unavoidable. but did this situation turn out to be a successful avoidance for you? Okay, thank you guys.